The grandfather clock in the marble-floored entrance hall of Blackwood Manor struck 3, its dignified chimes echoing through the sprawling Victorian mansion. Alexander Blackwood stood at his study window, absently adjusting his bespoke suit cuff as he observed his wife Victoria greeting their newest household staff member. Even from this distance, something about the elderly woman's bearing made him pause, his fingers stilling on the platinum cufflink. The late autumn sunlight caught the silver in the new housekeeper's hair, and for a moment, Alexander's breath caught in his throat. That particular way she tilted her head as Victoria spoke, the subtle gesture of tucking a stray lock behind her ear. It was hauntingly familiar. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, memories he'd long suppressed, threatening to surface. "Mrs. Margaret Thompson," Victoria had announced earlier that morning over breakfast, sliding the CV across their antique mahogany dining table. "She comes highly recommended by the Harrington family. I believe she'll be perfect for overseeing the household staff." Alexander had barely glanced at the document, trusting his wife's impeccable judgment in such matters. Now he wished he'd paid more attention. Thompson, his mother's maiden name, a common enough surname, he told himself firmly, yet his heart refused to slow its sudden rapid beating. The manor's grounds stretched out before him, perfectly manicured gardens leading to the wrought iron gates that separated their world from the historic town beyond. Oakminster had been his family's home for generations, its cobblestone streets and medieval cathedral spires as much a part of his heritage as the textile empire he'd built upon his father's foundation. Victoria guided Mrs. Thompson toward the servants' entrance, her elegant gestures suggesting she was explaining something about the property. His wife embodied everything he'd sought in a partner: graceful, sophisticated, and above all stable. The complete opposite of his mother, Eleanor, who had vanished during a business trip to Milan 3 decades ago, leaving behind nothing but questions and a void he'd spent his adult life trying to fill with success and control. A soft knock at his study door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called out, straightening his posture and smoothing any trace of emotion from his features. "Mr. Blackwood, sir." Jenkins, his personal assistant, appeared with a stack of documents. "The quarterly reports from the Lancashire factory require your signature, and there's a matter concerning the new textile machinery imports from Germany." Alexander welcomed the distraction of work, moving to his desk with practiced efficiency. Yet as he reviewed contracts and profit margins, his thoughts kept straying to the woman in the gardens below. Something in the way she moved, the grace of her movements despite her age. That evening, dressed for dinner in his usual formal attire, Alexander made his way to the main dining room. The familiar scent of beeswax polish and fresh flowers filled the air, but another aroma caught his attention, a particular blend of herbs he hadn't encountered since childhood, his mother's signature soup. He found Victoria supervising the table setting, her dark hair elegantly styled, diamonds glinting at her throat. "Darling, Mrs. Thompson mentioned she knew a wonderful recipe for wild mushroom soup. I hope you don't mind that I asked her to prepare it tonight." Alexander's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the back of his chair. That soup had been a family recipe, one his mother had claimed to have learned from her own grandmother. How could this new housekeeper possibly know it? Through the service door, he caught a glimpse of Mrs. Thompson directing the kitchen staff. She wore the formal black dress Victoria required of all senior household staff, her silver hair neatly arranged. As if sensing his gaze, she turned slightly, and Alexander found himself staring into eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets. The soup, when served, was identical to his memories, the same earthy aroma, the precise balance of herbs. Alexander ate mechanically, his mind racing. Victoria chatted about plans for the upcoming autumn charity gala, seemingly oblivious to his distraction. Later that night, unable to sleep, Alexander slipped down to his study. The autumn wind whistled through the manor's ancient chimneys as he unlocked a drawer he hadn't opened in years. Inside lay a photograph album, its leather binding cracked with age. By lamplight, he found the image he sought, his mother at his 10th birthday party, serving that very same soup. He held the photograph closer, studying Eleanor's features, the way she stood, the tilt of her head. The resemblance to Mrs. Thompson was subtle but undeniable. Questions multiplied in his mind like threads in a complex tapestry. Why now, after 30 years? What brought this woman to his household? And most troubling of all, why did she know things only his mother could have known? Outside his study window, clouds parted to reveal a full moon illuminating the manor's gardens. In the silver light, shadows seemed to hold secrets, and the past felt closer than ever. Alexander replaced the photograph with trembling fingers, aware that his carefully ordered world had begun to unravel with the arrival of one elderly housekeeper. Victoria Blackwood prided herself on her attention to detail. It was this particular trait that had first drawn Alexander's attention during their courtship 5 years ago, and it was serving her well now as she observed the subtle changes in her husband's behavior since Mrs. Thompson's arrival 3 weeks ago. The morning light streamed through the conservatory windows as Victoria sipped her Earl Grey, watching Mrs. Thompson tend to the indoor herbs with practiced care. The elderly housekeeper had proved herself invaluable, bringing order to the household with quiet efficiency. Yet there was something else, something in the way she moved through the manor's rooms as if she'd walked them 1,000 times before. "The lavender needs more sunlight," Mrs. Thompson murmured, more to herself than to Victoria. Eleanor always said it was particular about its placement. Victoria's teacup paused halfway to her lips. It was the 3rd time this week that Mrs. Thompson had casually mentioned Alexander's mother. Each reference was subtle, delivered as if the information was common knowledge rather than intimate family history. "Mrs. Thompson," Victoria called out softly, "would you join me for a moment?" The housekeeper approached with that peculiar grace that seemed at odds with her apparent age. Up close, Victoria could see the intelligence in her eyes, the careful way she held herself, like someone carrying a precious secret. "The herb garden reminds me of one I knew long ago," Mrs. Thompson offered, settling into the chair Victoria indicated. "In a grand house much like this one," Victoria set her teacup down with deliberate care. "How fascinating. And where was this house, if I may ask?" "Oh, here and there," Mrs. Thompson replied with a gentle smile that revealed nothing. One tends to see many grand houses in service. Through the conservatory's glass walls, Victoria could see Alexander in his morning routine, pacing the gravel path as he dictated notes to Jenkins. Her husband's usual measured stride had acquired a restless quality lately, and she'd noticed him spending long hours in his study, poring over old family photographs. "I must say," Victoria ventured carefully, "you've brought such wonderful changes to our household. That wild mushroom soup recipe, for instance. Alexander was quite moved by it." Mrs. Thompson's hands, wrinkled but elegant, folded carefully in her lap. "Old family recipes are precious things, aren't they? They carry memories in every ingredient." The autumn breeze rustled through the conservatory plants, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain. Victoria studied the woman before her, noting how her silver hair caught the light in a way that reminded her of a portrait she'd seen in the manor's gallery, a painting of Eleanor Blackwood in her youth. "Tell me, Mrs. Thompson," Victoria said, her voice gentle but firm, "what brought you to seek employment at Blackwood Manor specifically?" A shadow passed across Mrs. Thompson's face, quick as a cloud across the sun. "Sometimes, Mrs. Blackwood, life has a way of bringing us exactly where we need to be." The grandfather clock chimed in the distance, its sound carrying through the manor's corridors. Victoria noticed how Mrs. Thompson's fingers twitched slightly at the sound, as if remembering something from long ago. Rising from her chair, Mrs. Thompson returned to the herbs, her movements precise and purposeful. Victoria remained seated, her mind working through the implications of what she'd observed. As wife to one of Oakminster's most prominent businessmen, she'd learned the value of patience, of watching and waiting before acting. That afternoon, while reviewing the household accounts in her private sitting room, Victoria made a decision. Opening her laptop, she began a search for the Harrington family, Mrs. Thompson's supposed previous employers. Her social connections in Oakminster's upper circles were extensive, yet she'd never heard them mention a housekeeper of Mrs. Thompson's caliber. A knock at her door interrupted her research. "Come in," she called, closing the laptop smoothly. Alexander entered, looking somewhat distracted. "Victoria, have you seen the old family albums? I could have sworn I left them in my study." Perhaps Mrs. Thompson tidied them away while cleaning, Victoria suggested, watching her husband's reaction carefully. She seems to have an excellent understanding of how things should be organized in a house like this. Alexander's expression flickered for a moment. Yes, she does, doesn't she? Almost as if... He trailed off, running a hand through his silver-streaked, dark hair. As if what, darling? Victoria prompted gently. But Alexander had already turned away, his attention caught by something in the garden below. Mrs. Thompson was walking the grounds, her black dress a stark contrast against the autumn colors. She paused beneath the old oak tree, Eleanor's favorite reading spot, Victoria recalled from family stories. "I have some business calls to make," Alexander said abruptly, straightening his tie. "Will you excuse me?" After he left, Victoria moved to the window, watching Mrs. Thompson complete her circuit. Of the gardens, the elderly housekeeper stopped at precisely the places that held significance in the Blackwood family history. The rose garden Eleanor had planted, the stone bench where family photographs had been taken, the small herb garden that had fallen into disrepair after her disappearance. Thunder rumbled in the distance as storm clouds gathered over Oakminster's cathedral spires. Victoria made another decision. Opening her desk drawer, she removed a small key she'd never used, the key to Eleanor's private sitting room, which had remained locked since her disappearance. Perhaps it was time to unlock more than just a door. The autumn renovation of Blackwood. Manor's east wing began with the sharp crack of sledgehammers against plaster. Alexander stood in what had once been his mother's private sitting room, watching as workers carefully removed sections of the old walls. Victoria had suggested modernizing the manor's electrical systems, but something else had drawn him to start with this particular room. "Sir," one of the workers called out, his voice echoing in the half-empty space, "you might want to see this." Alexander approached the exposed section of wall where decades-old wallpaper had concealed a small alcove. Inside lay a leather portfolio, its surface dulled with age. His hands trembled slightly as he retrieved it, the leather cool against his fingers. "That will be all for today," he announced, his tone brooking no argument. The workers filed out, leaving him alone with his discovery. The portfolio contained documents in Italian, contracts bearing his father's signature alongside unfamiliar names. One photograph slipped free, a younger version of his father standing before a Milanese textile mill with two women. One was clearly his mother, Eleanor. The other woman, bearing a striking resemblance to Eleanor, had been carefully scratched out of the image. A soft knock interrupted his examination. "Come in," he called, hastily gathering the documents. Mrs. Thompson entered with a tea tray, her movements as precisely graceful as ever. "I thought you might need refreshment, sir. Renovations can be quite dusty work." Alexander watched as she arranged the tea service, not on the modern side table Victoria had recently purchased, but on the exact spot where his mother had always preferred her tea to be served. The coincidence sent a chill down his spine. "Tell me, Mrs. Thompson," he said carefully, "have you worked in many historic homes?" "Oh yes, quite a few." She poured the tea with practiced ease. "Though none quite like Blackwood Manor. Houses like this hold such fascinating histories within their walls, wouldn't you agree?" Her emphasis on the last word seemed deliberate, her eyes flickering briefly to the exposed alcove. Alexander's grip tightened on the portfolio. "Indeed, they do, though sometimes histories are better left undisturbed." "Are they, sir?" Mrs. Thompson straightened, smoothing her black dress. "I've found that buried secrets have a way of surfacing, like bulbs pushing through winter soil." Before Alexander could respond, Victoria appeared in the doorway, her elegant figure silhouetted against the corridor light. "Darling, the Historical Society Committee is here about the Autumn Festival. They're waiting in the drawing room." Mrs. Thompson gathered the tea tray with fluid efficiency. As she passed Victoria, she paused. The Autumn Festival always was Eleanor's favorite time of year. She particularly loved the candlelit procession through the cathedral grounds. Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. That particular tradition had only been established in the past decade, long after Eleanor's disappearance. She caught Alexander's eye, but he had already turned back to the exposed wall, his shoulders tense. Later that evening, in their private sitting room, Victoria approached the subject carefully. The renovations seemed to be progressing well. Alexander barely looked up from the portfolio in his lap. Did you know there was a textile mill in Milan? Father never mentioned any Italian connections in our business history. Perhaps there are records in the company archives, Victoria suggested, settling beside him. Jenkins could... No, Alexander. Cut in sharply. This stays between us. Something isn't right, Victoria. These documents suggest a partnership, a significant one, but there's no trace of it in our official records. Victoria placed her hand over his. And Mrs. Thompson? Have you noticed how she seems to know things? Things about your mother? About the house? She claims the Harringtons recommended her, Alexander said slowly. But when I called Charles Harrington yesterday, he had no recollection of any housekeeper by that name. The fire crackled in the grate, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the distant sound of cathedral bells. The autumn festival was approaching, and with it, the entire town would descend upon Blackwood, manor for the traditional opening ceremony. There's something else, Victoria hesitated. I found this in the library archives. She handed him a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline announced the opening of a new Blackwood textile mill in Yorkshire, dated just weeks before Eleanor's disappearance. In the accompanying photograph, Alexander's father stood proudly before the building, and there in the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was a woman who could have been Mrs. Thompson's twin. Alexander's hands shook as he studied the image. This is impossible, she'd have to be. The same age then as she appears now, Victoria finished softly. Alexander, I think it's time we talk to her directly. A floorboard creaked outside their room, and both turned to look. Through the partially open door, they caught a glimpse of a black dress disappearing around the corner, the soft click of sensible shoes on hardwood fading into silence. The annual Oakminster Autumn Festival transformed the historic town into a tapestry of golden lights and harvest decorations. Blackwood Manor, as tradition dictated, hosted the opening reception. Victoria supervised the preparations with her usual efficiency, though her attention kept straying to Mrs. Thompson, who moved through the chaos with unnatural calm. The flower arrangements should feature chrysanthemums, Mrs. Thompson advised the florist. White ones specifically. They're traditional for the festival. Victoria frowned slightly. The chrysanthemum tradition was a private one, started by Eleanor Blackwood and continued by the family in her memory. It wasn't common knowledge outside their immediate circle. Mrs. Thompson, Victoria called out, might I have a word in the conservatory? The elderly housekeeper followed, her posture perfect, her grey hair catching the morning light. In the Idiom, 3 months since her arrival, she had become indispensable to the household, yet the mysteries surrounding her had only deepened. The guest list for tonight, Victoria began, handling her a carefully typed document. We'll need additional settings for the European delegates. Mr. Blackwood's textile partners from Italy will be attending. Mrs. Thompson's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she accepted the list. Italian guests? How interesting. Will Mr. Romano be among them? Victoria kept her expression neutral, though her pulse quickened. The name Romano appeared in the documents they'd found in the wall, but it hadn't been mentioned in decades. I'm not familiar with that name, should I be? Oh, merely an old business associate, I believe, Mrs. Thompson replied smoothly. From another time. The sound of a car on the gravel drive interrupted their conversation. Through the conservatory, glass, they watched Alexander greeting an elderly Italian gentleman who emerged from a sleek black vehicle. Signor Conti, Mrs. Thompson murmured, though she couldn't possibly see the visitor's face from this distance. He hasn't aged well. Victoria turned sharply, but Mrs. Thompson had already moved away, issuing instructions to the staff about the evening's arrangements. The morning passed in a whirl of activity, yet Victoria's mind kept returning to that moment, to the impossible recognition in the housekeeper's voice. By evening, Blackwood Manor glowed with warmth and light. Guests filled the grand reception rooms, their conversations creating a gentle buzz beneath the classical music. Alexander worked the crowd with practiced ease, though Victoria noticed how his attention kept straying to Signor Conti, who had stationed himself near the grand fireplace. Mrs. Thompson appeared at Victoria's elbow with a tray of champagne. "Signor Conti prefers the French vintage," she said softly. "Eleanor always made sure to have it available when he visited." Before Victoria could respond, the housekeeper had melted away into the crowd. Across the room she saw Alexander stiffen, his hand freezing halfway to his pocket watch, another of his mother's habits. The evening progressed like a carefully choreographed dance, but beneath the surface, Victoria sensed currents of tension. She noticed how Signor Conti's eyes followed Mrs. Thompson, how his weathered face paled when she approached with his preferred champagne. Later, as the party reached its peak, Victoria found herself near the elderly Italian businessman. "Signor Conti," she said warmly, "I trust you're enjoying the evening?" "Ah, Mrs. Blackwood," he replied, his accent thick with age and emotion. "Your hospitality reminds me of another time, another hostess." His eyes drifted to where Mrs. Thompson stood adjusting a flower arrangement. "Though perhaps some ghosts never truly leave us." "Ghosts, Signor?" Victoria prompted gently. The old man's hands shook slightly as he set down his glass. "There are things about the Blackwood family, about Eleanor, secrets that should perhaps remain buried, for everyone's sake." A commotion near the entrance hall drew their attention. Alexander stood frozen at the foot of the grand staircase, staring at something in his hands. As Victoria approached, she saw it was a photograph that must have fallen from the old family album displayed for the occasion. The image showed Eleanor Blackwood at what appeared to be a business dinner in Milan. Behind her stood two men, Alexander's father and Signor Conti, both decades younger. But it was the woman seated beside Eleanor that drew Victoria's eye. Though the photo had aged, the resemblance was unmistakable. Mrs. Thompson, looking exactly as she did now, 30 years ago. "It's not possible," Alexander whispered, his composure cracking. Victoria touched his arm gently, aware of the guests beginning to notice his distress. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in private." "Yes, privacy would be wise," came Mrs. Thompson's voice from behind them. She stood at the foot of the stairs, her black dress blending with the shadows. "There are matters long overdue for discussion, but this is hardly the venue." Signor Conti had approached, his face ashen. "Margaret," he said softly, addressing Mrs. Thompson. "I never thought, after all these years." "The years have been kinder to some of us than others, Roberto," she replied, her voice carrying echoes of another time, another accent. The grandfather clock struck 10, its chimes echoing through the suddenly hushed reception hall. Through the grand windows, the autumn moon cast long shadows across the manor's gardens, where Eleanor's beloved chrysanthemums glowed white against the darkness. The time for secrets, it seemed, was drawing to a close. The morning after the festival dawned grey and misty over Oakminster. Alexander sat in his study, the photograph from the previous night placed carefully on his desk beside the documents found in the wall. Victoria stood by the window, watching Mrs. Thompson tend to the chrysanthemums in the garden below, her movements deliberate and familiar. "We need answers," Alexander said, his voice hoarse from a sleepless night. Signor Conti left the party immediately after that exchange. "His secretary claims he took the first flight back to Milan this morning." Victoria turned from the window. "Perhaps that's our answer, Milan. Everything seems to lead back there. The mill, the contracts, your mother's last known location." A soft knock interrupted their discussion. Mrs. Thompson entered, carrying not the usual morning tea service, but a wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl. Alexander's breath caught. He recognized it as his mother's jewelry box, which had vanished along with her. "I believe it's time we had that discussion," Mrs. Thompson said, placing the box on the desk. Her usual servile manner had fallen away, replaced by something more refined, more familiar. "That box," Alexander began, his hands gripping the arms of his leather chair. "Where did you find it?" "Find it?" Mrs. Thompson smiled gently. "My dear boy, Eleanor gave it to me for safekeeping 30 years ago, just before everything changed." Victoria moved to stand behind her husband's chair, her hand resting supportively on his shoulder. "You knew Eleanor personally then?" "Knew her?" Mrs. Thompson's laugh held a trace of something that might have been pain. "I shared her first. breath in this world. She reached up and slowly removed a delicate chain from beneath her collar, revealing a locket identical to the one Alexander remembered his mother wearing. We were twins. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of cathedral bells. Alexander stared at the locket, memories flooding back of playing with it as a child while seated in his mother's lap. "Impossible," he whispered. But even as he spoke, pieces began falling into place, the familiar gestures, the intimate knowledge of family traditions, the way she moved through the house as if she'd lived there all her life. Mrs. Thompson, or whoever she truly was, opened the jewelry box with practiced ease, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the velvet lining. From it, she withdrew a bundle of letters, their paper yellowed with age. "Your father's textile empire wasn't built solely on British soil," she began, spreading the letters across the desk. "The Italian connection was crucial, particularly the partnership with the Romano family. Your mother and I grew up in Milan, you see. The arranged marriage to your father was meant to unite the two most powerful textile families in Europe." Victoria picked up one of the letters, her eyes widening as she scanned its contents. "These are from Eleanor to you. They're dated after her disappearance." "Yes," Mrs. Thompson nodded. "She never abandoned you, Alexander. She was protecting you, protecting everyone." Alexander's hand shook as he reached for the letters. "Protecting us from what?" "From the truth about the Romano inheritance. You see, your grandfather Romano had certain business practices that would have ruined both families had they come to light. When evidence of these practices surfaced, Eleanor had to make a choice. The autumn wind rattled the study windows, sending shadows dancing across the walls. In the garden below, the white chrysanthemums swayed, their petals catching the weak sunlight. "The mill in Milan," Alexander said slowly. "It wasn't just a textile factory, was it?" Mrs. Thompson, his aunt, shook her head. The Romano family had been using it to hide their real operations for decades. When Eleanor discovered this, she also learned that your father was being blackmailed. She couldn't bear to see everything you would inherit tainted by scandal. Victoria studied the elderly woman's face, seeing now the clear resemblance to the photographs of Eleanor. So she disappeared to protect the family name. But why didn't she ever return? Because the evidence never went away. The Romano family made sure of that. They kept it as insurance, using it to control your father's business decisions for years. Eleanor's disappearance was the price of keeping the scandal buried. Alexander stood abruptly, moving to the window. "And now? Why come forward after all this time?" "Because Eleanor is ill," Mrs. Thompson said softly. "She sent me to prepare the way, to help you understand. She wants to see you one last time. But first, you need to know the whole truth about your inheritance." Victoria watched her husband's reflection in the window glass, saw the war of emotions playing across his face. The controlled businessman was gone, replaced by the little boy who had lost his mother too soon. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In a small villa outside Milan. The same villa where we grew up, where all of this began." Mrs. Thompson rose, her movement graceful despite her age. "She's waiting for you, Alexander. But there's more you need to know before you go to her." The grandfather clock struck noon, its chimes seeming to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Alexander turned from the window, his face set with determination. "Tell me everything," he said. "No more secrets." The library of Blackwood Manor had always been Alexander's sanctuary, but now it felt different. Surrounded by leather-bound volumes and family portraits, he sat with Victoria and his newly revealed aunt as the story of his heritage unfolded like an ancient tapestry. "Your grandfather Romano," Margaret began, handling a faded photograph. With careful fingers, was obsessed with maintaining control of the European textile trade. The marriage between Eleanor and your father was arranged to merge the British and Italian operations, but there was a condition, one that Eleanor didn't discover until after you were born. Victoria leaned forward, her hand finding Alexander's. "What condition?" "The inheritance would only pass to a male heir who married according to family approval. Eleanor's marriage had fulfilled that requirement, but your future was already being arranged, Alexander. The Romano family had selected A bride for you before you could even walk. Alexander's free hand clenched. I made my own choice. I married Victoria because I loved her. Margaret smiled gently. Yes, you did, and that's exactly what Eleanor wanted. For you to be free to choose your own path, but her defiance came at a price. From her ever-present black handbag, Margaret withdrew a small leather diary. Eleanor kept records of everything. The Romano family's true business dealings, the threatened exposures, the bribes paid to keep scandals quiet. When she discovered that your arranged marriage had already been documented in a contract, she knew she had to act. Victoria rose, moving to the library's bay window. Below, the garden paths wound through autumn flowers, leading to the old gazebo, where she and Alexander had first met at a summer garden party. But surely a marriage contract for a child couldn't have been legally binding. In isolation, no, Margaret replied. But combined with the evidence of the family's other activities, it would have brought scrutiny that neither family could afford. The Romano Empire was built on more than just textiles. There were property deals, political arrangements, financial transactions that wouldn't bear investigation. Alexander opened the diary with trembling fingers, recognizing his mother's elegant handwriting. She could have come to me when I was older, explained everything. She wanted to, Margaret's voice softened. Every year on your birthday, she would watch from a distance. I remember the day you met Victoria. Eleanor was in Oakminster, you know. She saw you together in the park, saw how you looked at each other. It gave her hope that her sacrifice had been worth it. Victoria returned to her seat, her mind working through the implications. The Italian delegates at the festival, they recognized you, didn't they? Some of them, Margaret nodded. The older ones, those who remembered the Romano twins. Eleanor and I were quite notorious in Milan society before her marriage. After she left, I became her eyes and ears, watching over the family interests, making sure the Romano influence didn't reach too far into the Blackwood business. Alexander stood suddenly, moving to the portrait of his father that hung above the fireplace. Did he know? All those years? Did he know where she was? No, Margaret said firmly. Your father was a good man, Alexander. Eleanor knew that if he discovered the truth, he would have tried to fight the Romano family, to clear their name. She couldn't risk that. The evidence they held would have ruined not just the family name, but dozens of innocent people connected to the business. Victoria studied the elderly woman who had entered their lives as a housekeeper and now sat before them as family. But something has changed, hasn't it? Something that made it safe for you to come forward now. Margaret's expression grew serious. Roberto Conti's reaction at the festival wasn't just shock at seeing me. He came to warn us. The Romano family's influence is finally waning. The old guard is dying out, and with them the power of their secrets. But there's something else. She paused, glancing at the garden visible through the library windows. Eleanor isn't just ill. She's ready to expose everything. She's prepared documents detailing the entire history to be released to the authorities. But before that happens, she wanted you to understand why she left, to know that everything she did was to protect your future. The autumn sunlight slanted through the library's stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the floor. Alexander moved to his aunt's chair, kneeling beside it. Take me to her, he said softly. Margaret reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched his cheek. There's more you need to know first about Victoria's family. Victoria straightened in her chair. My family? What do they have to do with this? Your father's shipping company, Margaret said carefully, wasn't chosen at random for the Blackwood export contracts. Eleanor had been watching you long before you met Alexander. She saw a way to protect the future of both families. The cathedral bells rang out across Oakminster, marking the hour. In the garden, the white chrysanthemums glowed in the afternoon. Light, their petals holding secrets yet to be revealed. Victoria stood in her father's study at the Harrison family estate, just outside Oakminster. The room smelled of leather and old books, just as it had throughout her childhood. But now, examining the familiar space with new eyes, she noticed details she'd overlooked before. The Italian art on the walls, the subtle Romano family crest woven into the corner of an antique rug. I always wondered why Father insisted I Attend so many social events in Oakminster, she mused, running her fingers along the spines of leather-bound ledgers, particularly those hosted by the Blackwoods. Alexander stood by the window, watching autumn leaves scatter across the manicured lawn. Margaret sat in the wing chair by the fireplace, her posture revealing more of the Milano society woman she'd once been than the housekeeper she'd pretended to be. Your father's shipping company, Harrison Maritime, was the perfect solution, Margaret explained. Clean, legitimate, with roots throughout Europe. Eleanor saw the possibility of a partnership that could gradually separate the Blackwood enterprises from Romano influence. Victoria pulled a ledger from the shelf, its pages filled with her father's meticulous handwriting. Did my father know? About Eleanor, about the Romano family. Not everything, Margaret replied, but he knew enough. Harrison Maritime had encountered the Romano family's business practices in Mediterranean ports. He understood the importance of providing Alexander with alternative shipping arrangements. Alexander turned from the window. The textile exports. Father always insisted we use Harrison Maritime exclusively, even when other companies offered better rates. Yes, Margaret nodded. It ensured that your goods moved through clean channels untouched by Romano influence, but more importantly, it created a legitimate paper trail, one that could withstand any scrutiny. Victoria found herself at her father's desk, remembering all the times she'd watched him work late into the night, reviewing shipping manifests and route plans. The summer garden party where Alexander and I met, that wasn't a coincidence, was it? Eleanor hoped you might meet naturally, yes, but she never interfered with your relationship. She just created opportunities. Alexander joined Victoria at the desk, his hand resting supportively on her shoulder. Your father's recent retirement, his insistence that you take a more active role in the company, was that part of the plan too? Before Margaret could answer, the study door opened. Richard Harrison stood in the doorway, his silver hair gleaming in the afternoon light. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Margaret. I thought I might find you here, he said quietly. When I saw the news about the Romano family in the financial papers this morning, I knew it was time. Victoria stared at her father. You knew, all this time. Richard Harrison crossed to his desk, opening a hidden panel Victoria had never noticed before. From it, he withdrew a thick envelope. Eleanor approached me 28 years ago, he explained, his voice heavy with long-kept secrets. She showed me evidence of what the Romano family was doing in Mediterranean ports. We worked together to create a network of clean shipping routes, gradually moving Blackwood exports away from compromised channels. And my meeting Victoria? Alexander asked. Was that engineered too? Richard smiled softly at his daughter. No, that was pure chance. The best kind of chance. Eleanor was overjoyed when she heard. It meant her plan could work without manipulation, without forcing anyone's hand. He handed the envelope to Alexander. These are the original shipping records from the Milano route, dating back 30 years. They show exactly how the Romano family used legitimate businesses to hide their real operations. Eleanor asked me to keep them safe, in case they were ever needed. Victoria opened the envelope, spreading the documents across her father's desk. Years of shipping manifests, port records, and financial transactions told a story of systematic deception and of Eleanor's careful work to disentangle the Blackwood business from it. There's something else you should know, Richard said, looking at his daughter. Your mother didn't leave us because of illness, as I'd told you. She was Eleanor's closest friend in Oakminster. When Eleanor needed to disappear, your mother helped arrange it. The strain of keeping that secret, it was too much for her. She chose to start a new life in Canada. Victoria sank into her father's chair, memories of her mother rearranging themselves into a new pattern. The mysterious phone calls, the unexpected trips abroad, the sad smiles when young Victoria mentioned Alexander's family. Margaret rose from her chair by the fireplace. Eleanor wanted to tell you everything herself, but first we needed to be certain the Romano influence was truly broken. This morning's financial news confirms it. Their empire is crumbling. The evidence Eleanor has gathered is already in the hands of authorities in 3 countries. The autumn sun was setting behind the Harrison estate's ancient oaks casting long shadows across the study. In the distance, Oakminster Cathedral's bells rang out, their sound carrying across the countryside to where two families' destinies had been quietly intertwined for decades. Richard Harrison moved to the drinks cabinet, pouring 4 glasses of his finest scotch. "I think," he said quietly, "it's time for you to meet Eleanor. She's been waiting a very long time for this day." The private terminal at Oakminster's small airport hummed with quiet activity as dawn broke over the runway. Alexander stood at the window, watching ground crew prepare the Harrison family's private jet for the flight to Milan. Victoria was beside him, her hand clasped tightly in his. "Everything's arranged at the villa," Margaret said, reviewing details on her phone, no longer playing the role of elderly housekeeper. "Eleanor's doctors have cleared her for visitors, though they insist we keep the initial meeting brief." Alexander turned from the window. "How ill is she, really?" Margaret's face softened. "The treatments are helping, but she needs peace, Alexander. Peace that can only come from reconciliation, from knowing you understand why she made the choices." "She did." Victoria squeezed her husband's hand. "Tell us about the villa. Help us prepare for what we'll find there." "It's been in the Romano family for generations," Margaret began, leading them to the private lounge's comfortable seating area. "Eleanor and I grew up there in the years before the families arranged. Her marriage to your father, it's where she's felt safest all these years." Richard Harrison joined them carrying a portfolio of documents. "The property is now legally Eleanor's." Part of the evidence she gathered included proof that the villa had been purchased with legitimate Romano family funds, one of the few properties that was clean. "The gardens are her sanctuary," Margaret continued, her voice taking on a distant quality. "She's recreated the chrysanthemum beds from Blackwood Manor. Every autumn she would have photos sent to her of the manor's gardens, so she could match them exactly." Alexander closed his eyes briefly, remembering countless afternoons, watching his mother tend those flowers. "The soup recipe, the household traditions. You've been preparing me for this reunion all along, haven't you?" "Eleanor wanted you to feel her presence gradually," Margaret nodded. "To understand that she never truly left you, that everything she did was to ensure you could live free from Romano influence." Victoria had been studying the villa's photographs on Margaret's phone. "These sculptures in the garden, they're identical to the ones at Blackwood Manor." "Yes," Margaret smiled. "Eleanor had them commissioned by the same artist. She wanted to maintain a connection even if she couldn't be physically present." Richard checked his watch. "The jet will be ready in 30 minutes. Victoria, darling, are you certain you don't want me to come with you?" Victoria embraced her father. "You've carried this secret for so long, Dad. Let us carry it forward now." The terminal's large windows offered a view of Oakminster Cathedral in the distance, its spires catching the morning light. Alexander found himself remembering all the festivals, all the ceremonies where he'd felt his mother's absence like a physical ache. Now understanding was slowly replacing that pain. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said carefully. "Eleanor has prepared letters for both of you, her perspective on everything that's happened. She wanted you to have them before you meet, so you can process her words in private." She withdrew 2 envelopes from her bag, each sealed with the Romano family crest. Alexander accepted his with trembling fingers, while Victoria held hers, like a precious artifact. "Read them on the flight," Margaret suggested. "It will help prepare you for the meeting." The airport's intercom system announced their flight was ready for boarding. As they gathered their belongings, Alexander paused, looking back at the cathedral spires. "All these years," he said softly, "I thought she abandoned us. I built my entire life around proving I didn't need her." Victoria touched his arm gently. "And in doing so, you proved her sacrifice was worth it. You built something honest and true." "The car is waiting," Margaret announced. "Eleanor always said timing was everything. In business, in family, in reconciliation. It's time, Alexander, time to bring your mother home." As they walked across the tarmac to the waiting jet, the autumn wind carried the distant sound of cathedral bells across the countryside. In Milan, in a villa surrounded by chrysanthemums, Eleanor Blackwood was preparing to embrace her son for the first time in 30 years. The truth, so long buried beneath layers of protection and sacrifice, was finally blooming, like the flowers she'd never stopped tending. The private jet cruised at altitude, the English countryside long since replaced by continental Europe beneath them. Alexander sat in the leather seat, his mother's letter unopened in his hands. Across the aisle, Victoria was already reading hers, tears silently tracking down her cheeks. Margaret dozed in the rear of the cabin, the morning's preparations having taken their toll. For the first time since her arrival at Blackwood Manor, she looked truly her age, the weight of 3 decades of secrets evident in the lines of her face. Finally, Alexander broke the seal on his envelope. His mother's handwriting, so familiar from the recently discovered documents, filled several pages. My dearest Alexander, by the time you read this, Margaret will have explained much of what happened 30 years ago, but there are things on my mother can only say to her son directly. First and most importantly, leaving you was the hardest choice I have ever made. Every step I've taken since that day has been to protect you and the legacy you would build. The Romano family's influence was like a poisoned root spreading through European business circles, corrupting everything it touched. Your grandfather Romano, my father, had built his empire on secrets and leverage. When I discovered that he had already arranged your future marriage as part of a broader plan to consolidate power, I knew I had to act. The evidence I gathered would have brought down not just the Romano Empire, but dozens of innocent families caught in their web. The Blackwood name would have been tarnished, your future destroyed. They gave me a choice: disappear and keep silent, or watch everything collapse. But I made a third choice. With Margaret's help, and later with the assistance of Victoria's remarkable parents, I began the slow work of untangling the Blackwood enterprises from Romano influence. Every business decision your father made, every shipping route through Harrison Maritime was part of a careful plan to give you freedom. I watched you grow from afar. I saw you become the man I'd hoped you would be, strong, principled, independent. When you met Victoria, I wept with joy. The Harrison family's integrity was well known, and I'd seen how Richard and Catherine had raised their daughter with the same values I'd wanted for you. My illness now makes it impossible to maintain silence any longer. The Romano Empire is falling, their influence finally waning. But before the truth becomes public, I needed you to understand. Every Christmas gift that mysteriously appeared, every scholarship fund that supported your education, every business contact that helped. You expand the company. I was there working through others to smooth your path. The villa where we'll meet was my childhood home, shared with Margaret before our lives took such different paths. I've spent these years tending the gardens, creating a piece of Blackwood Manor here in Italy. The chrysanthemums bloom just as they do in Oakminster, a bridge between two worlds that should never have been separated. I know you have questions. I know there may be anger, confusion, even resentment. I accept that, but know that every day away from you was a day spent working to ensure your future would be your own, free from the obligations and corruption that had trapped so many others. Your father never knew the full truth. His only fault was trusting his in-laws too much in the beginning. By the time he realized the extent of their influence, he was too entangled to break free alone. My disappearance gave him the excuse to begin distancing the company from Italian interests, though he never knew that was my intention. The package Margaret carries contains all the evidence, every document, every transaction, every piece of leverage the Romano family used to control their business empire. It's already in the hands of authorities, but I wanted you to see it first to understand the choice I faced. Soon we'll meet in the villa's garden, among the flowers I've tended while watching you bloom from afar. I am not the same woman who left Blackwood Manor 30 years ago, just as you are no longer the little boy who played among the chrysanthemums. But I hope that together we can build something new from the truth that has finally been unearthed, with all my love and with the hope of your understanding, Mother. Alexander lowered the letter, aware of tears on his own cheeks. Victoria reached across the aisle, taking his hand in hers. Her letter lay open in her lap. She wrote to me about my mother, Victoria said softly, about their friendship, about how they worked together to protect both our families. All those years we thought she was running from illness. She was actually helping Eleanor. The monthly trips to Canada were cover for meetings, for exchanging information. The jet banked gently, beginning its descent toward Milan. Below, the Italian countryside spread out in autumn colors, so different from England yet somehow familiar. Alexander thought of the villa waiting below, of the garden his mother had created as a bridge between past and present. Margaret stirred in her seat, awakening. Seeing the letters in their hands, she smiled gently. Eleanor always said the truth, was like her chrysanthemums. It needed the right season to bloom. The villa stood on a hillside overlooking Milan, its Renaissance architecture softened by climbing roses and ancient cypress trees. As their car wound up the long driveway, Alexander caught glimpses of gardens through the trees, formal Italian, designs giving way to something more familiar, more English in style. She redesigned this section herself, Margaret explained, noting his interest. Said if she couldn't be at Blackwood Manor, she'd bring a piece of it here. Victoria squeezed Alexander's hand as the car came to a stop. The autumn air was warmer than in England, carrying the scent of roses and herb gardens. A butler appeared at the villa's entrance, as dignified as any at Blackwood Manor. "Mrs. Eleanor is waiting in the garden," he announced in accented English. "She asks that you follow the chrysanthemum path." The path wound through the grounds, white chrysanthemums lining either side, just as they did at home. Each turn revealed another echo of Blackwood Manor, the same variety of roses, the same arrangement of herb beds, even a scaled-down version of the gazebo where Alexander and Victoria had first met. They found Eleanor seated in that gazebo, wrapped in a light shawl against the autumn breeze. Her silver hair was elegantly styled, her posture as graceful as Margaret's. 30 years had written their story on her face, but her eyes, Alexander's eyes, were bright and alert. She rose as they approached, one hand gripping the back of her chair for support. For a moment, no one moved. Then Alexander stepped forward, closing the distance that 3 decades had placed between them. "The chrysanthemums bloomed early this year," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying traces of both Milan and Oakminster. "Just as they did the autumn you were born." Alexander stood before her, seeing in her face echoes of the photographs he'd treasured, of the memories he'd clung to. "You've been here all along," he said, "watching, waiting, protecting us from shadows we never knew existed." "Oh, my darling boy." Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. "You've grown into exactly the man I hoped you would be." Victoria stepped forward to stand beside her husband. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her daughter-in-law. "You look so much like your mother, Victoria. Catherine would be so proud of how you've helped bring truth back into our families." The autumn breeze stirred the chrysanthemums, carrying their subtle fragrance through the garden. Margaret moved to stand beside her twin, the similarities between them now strikingly apparent. "The authorities will make their moves against the remaining Romano interests next week," Margaret explained. "Eleanor's evidence, combined with what Richard Harrison provided, leaves no room for doubt." Eleanor gestured to the gazebo's comfortable seating. "Please, sit with me. There's so much still to explain, so many pieces to put together." As they settled into the chairs, a maid appeared with tea served in cups identical to those at Blackwood Manor. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she added milk to Alexander's cup, exactly as she had done 30 years ago. "Your father," she began carefully, "was a good man caught in an impossible situation. The Romano family had spent generations building their web of influence. When he realized what was happening, he tried to protect you in his own way. By focusing on the British operations," Alexander nodded, "by teaching me to run the company independently. Yes, every time he rejected a Romano business proposal, every time he chose Harrison Maritime for shipping, he was following the path I'd hoped he would take." Eleanor sipped her tea, her eyes distant with memories. "Margaret kept me informed of every decision, every success." Victoria leaned forward. "The family Bible that appeared on our wedding day, with the pressed chrysanthemum bookmark, that was from you." Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face. "My wedding gift to you both, a symbol of faith in the future you would build together." She turned to Alexander. "Your father received a similar gift on his last birthday. I think I think he understood then, at least partly. The note he left in the Manor's chapel mentioned chrysanthemums, Alexander started. You know about that. Margaret told me. She's been my eyes and ears, my hands in your lives when I couldn't be. There myself. Eleanor reached out, touching Alexander's hand gently. Every birthday, every Christmas, every triumph and challenge, I lived them all through her reports. The sun was setting over Milan, painting the garden in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, church bells rang out, their sound so similar to Oakminster Cathedral that for a moment the distance between past and present seemed to vanish. What happens now? Alexander asked, his voice thick with emotion. After the Romano Empire falls, after the truth comes out? Eleanor exchanged a glance with Margaret. That, my darling, depends on what you want. I'm too ill to return to England. Permanently, but perhaps Blackwood Manor could spare its master for regular visits to Italy. The chrysanthemums bloom beautifully in spring, as well as autumn. 6 months had passed since the meeting in Milan. Spring was giving way to early summer at Blackwood Manor, where preparations were underway for an event that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. Eleanor Blackwood was coming home. Victoria stood in what had once been Eleanor's sitting room, now restored to its former glory. The renovation had revealed more than just the hidden documents in the walls. It had uncovered a mother's careful planning for her son's future, preserved in every detail of the room's design. The doctors say the treatments are working better than expected, Margaret announced, entering with a stack of fresh linens. She had maintained her role as housekeeper, though now the staff knew her true identity. The Italian air has done wonders for her health. Alexander looked up from the newspaper he was reading by the window. The financial headlines told the story of the Romano Empire's collapse, though the full scandal had been carefully managed to protect innocent parties. Harrison Maritime's stock had actually risen, their reputation for ethical business practices drawing new clients. Father's diary arrived from the solicitor this morning, he said, holding up a worn leather volume. He knew more than we thought. Listen to this entry from just before his passing. The chrysanthemums bloomed early this year, just as they did when Eleanor left. Perhaps it's time for truth to flower as well. Victoria moved to sit beside him. He protected you in his own way, just as Eleanor did. The diary might help explain some of the business decisions that seemed odd at the time. A soft knock interrupted them. Jenkins, who had proved invaluable during the transition of the past months, entered with a tablet displaying a video call from Milan. Eleanor's face appeared on the screen, her color better than it had been during their first meeting. The doctors have cleared me for travel, she announced without preamble, her excitement evident. Margaret, dear, please tell me you've remembered about the herb garden. The lavender must be planted before midsummer for the best blooms. Margaret chuckled. Everything's ready, sister. The gardens are exactly as you left them, with a few modern improvements, Victoria suggested. The mention of improvements brought a sparkle to Eleanor's eyes. Ah, yes, Victoria. How is my grandchild treating you, darling? Victoria rested a hand on her slightly rounded belly. The news of her pregnancy had delighted Eleanor, who immediately began sharing family traditions and advice via their daily video calls. Better now that the morning sickness has passed, Victoria smiled, though your suggestion about ginger tea helped immensely. An old Romano family remedy, Eleanor nodded. Perhaps the only good thing I brought with me from that part of my life. Her expression grew thoughtful. Have you received the package from Catherine? Victoria nodded. Her mother, finally free to explain her long absence, had been sending regular parcels from Canada, filled with family mementos and letters. The latest contained a christening gown that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother. Mother's coming. For the homecoming celebration, Victoria said. She says it's time to bridge all the distances, not just geographical ones. Alexander moved to stand behind his wife's chair, visible in the video call. Jenkins has arranged everything with the authorities. The final Romano assets have been liquidated, with the proceeds going to the families affected by their practices. The villa will remain yours, of course. Eleanor's face softened. The villa will always be a second home for all of us now. A place of healing, not hiding. She glanced off screen. The doctors are here for my final checkup before travel. Margaret, sister, Remember, the white roses must be planted near the herb garden, I know," Margaret interrupted fondly. "Some things haven't changed in 30 years, dear sister." After the call ended, Alexander moved to the sitting room's bay window. The garden below was a riot of early summer colors, but his eyes were drawn to the chrysanthemum beds, newly planted for autumn blooming. "I had Jenkins retrieve something from the London vault," he said quietly. Victoria and Margaret watched as he removed an old velvet box from his briefcase. Inside lay a delicate silver necklace set with pearls. "Mother wore this at her wedding. Father kept it all these years in the vault, never telling anyone." Victoria touched the pearls gently. "For the homecoming?" Alexander nodded. "For new beginnings." He turned to Margaret. "The guest list for the celebration, you're certain everyone understands the sensitivity?" "Only those who already know the truth," Margaret assured him. "Richard has been particularly helpful in managing the business community's curiosity. As far as the world is concerned, Eleanor Blackwood is simply returning from an extended residence in Italy." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the pearls and sending prisms dancing across the walls. In the garden below, the gardeners were preparing the grounds for the celebration that would mark not just Eleanor's return, but the healing of wounds 3 decades in the making. The midsummer evening cast a golden glow over Blackwood Manor's gardens as guests gathered for what the local papers had dubbed a family reunion. The truth, known only to those in attendance, was far richer and more complex than any headline could capture. Eleanor Blackwood stood in her old sitting room, Margaret helping her fasten the pearl necklace Alexander had retrieved from the vault. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman transformed not just by time, but by the lifting of a burden carried for 30 years. "The gardens look exactly as I remembered," she said softly, though Victoria's addition of the Mediterranean herbs was inspired. A perfect blend of both worlds. Victoria entered, radiant in a gown that accommodated her growing belly. "The guests are arriving. Catherine and Richard are greeting them in the garden." She moved to help adjust Eleanor's shawl. Mother can hardly contain her excitement at seeing you again. "Catherine was my strength when I thought I would break from missing Alexander," Eleanor smiled. "Now she'll be here to see our families truly united." She touched Victoria's belly gently. "Through this little one." Alexander appeared in the doorway, impeccable in his formal wear. He paused, taking in the sight of his mother wearing the pearls that had been preserved for this moment. "Father would be proud," he said quietly, "of all of us." The sound of string music drifted up from the gardens, where lights twinkled in the early evening shadows. Eleanor took her son's offered arm, and together they made their way down the grand staircase that had missed her footsteps for so long. The gardens had been transformed. Tables draped in white linen were arranged around the fountain, while paths lined with lanterns led guests through the blooming flower beds. The Mediterranean herbs Victoria had planted filled the air with their fragrance, mingling with the roses Eleanor had loved since childhood. Richard and Catherine Harrison stood waiting at the garden entrance. Catherine rushed forward to embrace her old friend, tears flowing freely. "The letters weren't enough," she whispered. "Having you here, seeing you with your family." "Our family," Eleanor corrected gently, including Victoria in her glance. "All of us, together at last." The evening unfolded like a flower opening to the sun. Guests, all chosen for their connection to the true story, shared memories and hopes for the future. Signor Conti, now retired, raised a toast to truth that blooms in its own time. The elderly Italian businessman had proved instrumental in helping authorities unravel the last of the Romano Empire's influence. As the stars began to appear above the garden, Alexander stood to address the gathering. 30 years ago, this garden lost its heart when my mother left to protect our family's future. Today we celebrate not just her return, but the triumph of truth over secrecy, of love over fear. Victoria joined him, followed by Eleanor and Margaret. Catherine and Richard completed the circle. Alexander continued, his voice carrying across the hushed garden. "The chrysanthemums will bloom again this autumn, but they'll tell a different story now. A story of family bonds that bend but never break, of sacrifices made with love and of new beginnings." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "I kept a garden in Milan that mirrored this one, trying to stay connected to home. Now I understand that home isn't just a place. It's the truth we share, the love we protect, the future we build together. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Eleanor walked with Alexander and Victoria through the herb garden. The night air was sweet with lavender and rosemary, plants from both England and Italy growing side by side. "Your father left something else in the vault," Eleanor said, retrieving a small package from her evening bag. "A letter he wrote the day he realized I might someday come home." She handed it to Alexander. He understood more than I ever knew. Victoria touched the sundial at the garden center, Eleanor's wedding gift to her son and daughter-in-law. Its inscription read, "Time reveals truth's flowers." "The baby will know all of it," she promised. "Every story, every sacrifice, every act of love that brought us to this moment." Eleanor smiled, touching the pearls at her throat. The Romano Empire was built on secrets and fear. But the Blackwood legacy? She looked at her son, then at Victoria. "It will be built on truth and love." The fountains splashed softly in the background as fireflies began to dance among the flowers. Above them, the first stars of summer twinkled in a velvet sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new hopes. But tonight, in a garden where past and present bloomed together, a family long divided by secrets had finally found its way home. In the distance, Oakminster Cathedral's bells rang out, their sound carrying across the summer evening. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the familiar music wash over her. "Listen," she said softly. "The bells are welcoming us all home.